So I'd like to share with you guys a glimpse of some of the mysteries from a hidden SEFER that's being compiled right now. And I've been working on it in secret. I've considered sharing a portion of it in here via PDF, but I've decided against that. Instead, I'm just going to share with you guys some of the secrets that are contained within inside of it. So many questions arise as to the process of creation. And Likute, it is explained that the restriction takes place and then the hard spark. But some of the highest and loftiest mysteries take place in those initial moments of creation. And few have ever probed it to any proper degree by which it would manifest the secrets of what actually was occurring. So when we say a restriction, we see all these concentric circles, and yet what is going on with the concentric circles have never really been explained sufficiently. In the recent video, Emek Hamelek, I discussed the dew, or the droplets of Chokmah, the droplets of wisdom, and that was the beginning of it. But what I'd like to discuss with you guys is a secret passage from Sefer YIRAH that talks about how 3 mothers produced 3 father letters. And this, of course, hints to the 3 mother letters, which are Shin, Aleph, and Mem, and that they in turn produce the 3 father letters, an example, Yud-K, and Vav. And just as there are 2 letters in the mother letters, Mem and Mem Sophit, which makes 3, 4, so there are in the father letters, because the divine name Yud-K, Vav-K is 3 letters that produce a 4-letter word. And Yud-K, Vav-K, and Shin, Aleph, Mem, and Mem both personify the tree, as it's been explained inside of Likute. But how exactly did this occur, and what exactly caused this? So the first thing that we need to understand, and I've shared with you guys an image, a basic conceptualization of this matter. So we should be able to see through the Simsum the name Yud-K, Vav-K, and corresponding to it 72, 63, 45, 52. Those are the miluim, or the expansions of the divine name, that equal Gematria 72, Gematria 63, Gematria 45, Gematria 52. And these in turn represent Atzilus, Bria, Tzir, Nasiya. Now, all of the worlds are said to have all of the worlds, Atzilus, Bria, Tzir, Nasiya. So how does this actually correspond to this world, and how did this manifest? So first know that within inside of Ain itself, it was explained that the lights of the letters are in this place, within a wondrous unity, meaning that there was no separation, there was no division, there was no Zeh and Zot, there's no this and that. It was all in a wondrous unity. And nothing was outside of that unity, and there was no division within inside of that unity. And that unity within the endless itself represents the very being and substance and existence of that light. And it was also explained in the order of emanations in various other places that the cause of reality, the cause of the restriction, was the contemplation, or the desire, or the potential of what the endless is not. For it is known that God is all-knowing of self, all being of self, and therefore there is nothing in which God cannot know about himself. However, the question herein lies, what am I not? What is God not? Therefore, our sages veiled this language by saying the cause of reality was to create evil. Because how could one show evil to oneself? And similarly, other interesting paradoxical statements like this. But rather, instead of understanding that God, the purpose of creation was to bring forth a place for evil, we should understand it as the purpose of creation was to bring forth what God is not. For at the highest level, the illimitable one is a unified singularity, and the opposite of this is a limited multiplicity. So we are a limited multiplicity. The illimitable one is unbegotten and eternal. We are both begotten and temporary. The illimitable one is perfect. We are imperfect. The illimitable is in control of everything. And so what's the opposite of this? Not being in control. And so we have choice. The illimitable is endless without end to its boundary. And we are within a realm and domain of measurement and limits. And therefore, all of these things that are brought forth are the opposite. Everything that God is not, which creates this strange, bizarre paradox. So what exactly caused this? And how did it begin? And what manifested it? So I talked to you a little bit about Shin, Aleph, Mem, and Mem. And it's the core central teaching to many deep things. But there's a mystery hidden within inside of Shin, Aleph, Mem, Mem that unlocks the beginning. And so to understand this fully, it was mentioned in Likute that one should not even think the letters correspond to this place. That is to say, the level of Ain. One should not even think that the letters correspond to this place, but rather that the light or potential within the letters is what was in that place. And again, it was explained how these are in the mystery of a unified singularity, which means it existed by being. The opposite of being is potential. And so the very first realm that came into existence was a realm of potential. Furthermore, the opposite of knowing is not knowing. And so therefore, the first thing emanated was the mind. Contemplation, a desire arose to even have a thought. In order for the potential to even have a thought, or the potential to conceive a thought, the mind must first exist. The mind is a space in which thought can exist. There can be no thought without the mind. Thought exists within inside of the mind. And therefore, in the order of emanation, the restriction is called the mind, and the hard spark, which is the 231 gates, is called thought. This is alluded to by the fact that Israel, which hints the 231 gates, is called thought. Thus it says, in the beginning when Israel arose in thought. Furthermore, this first level, which was called Ain, when expanded, Aleph, Yod, Nun, has a numerical value of 231. This idea that when there was a movement within inside of the Ain, that there might even be a movement, immediately the 231 was brought forth. So what are the 231? So the 231, Sefer Yetzirah tells us, Aleph with every letter with Aleph. It's the combination of all 22 letters interacting with every other letter. There's no double pairings, and so Aleph can never merge with Aleph, because there's only the base letters. And so they all emerge with each other and intermingle with each other, and thus Sefer Yetzirah tells us Aleph with every letter with Aleph. That is to say, the principle of Aleph with every other principle, and every other principle with Aleph. So this potential is necessary and required in order for there to be any type of differentiation. In order for there to be differentiation, there must be spectrum. And so the 231 gates is the first order in magnitude of potential existence, that is to say. For the mind can only conceive what is within the spectrum of its potential, meaning that the mind cannot conceive anything that is outside of the spectrum of its potential. That is to say, in layman terms, you cannot conceive a thought that your mind is not programmed to conceive. In order for your mind to be capable of processing any type of information, it must be programmed the capability to do so. So this potential represents the archetypal mind. It also represents the archetypal thought. So returning to those points, now that we have this base understanding about Ain, and it's expanded, Aleph, Yod, Nun, hinting to 231, I'll explain to you the specifics. So when the endless sought to restrict itself, it did so from all directions, precisely in the center. And we learned in the Torah of Mashiach that this teaches that everything is circular at the highest level and the lowest level. But what else do we learn from this? We learn that the light withdrew in every direction, creating a circle. And that's our first key. Because light withdrew from the width, light withdrew from the length, light withdrew from the height, and light withdrew from the depth. These four directions is what created the vacancy. For the vacancy was a space which all the world would come into existence. Now we understand, again, that the right, the left, or the width and the length, the height and the depth is where the light contracted itself. And we know that the light withdrew from all directions precisely in the center. And this language was used in Likute, except the key to understanding its profound depth was not revealed. Because from the right, all that would be right would be rooted. And from the left, all that is left would be rooted. And from the height, all that is in the height would be rooted. And from the depth, all that would be the depth would be rooted. And the roots of these four directions were manifested by the principle of the mother letters. For the principle of the mother letters, Shin, Aleph, Mem, and Mem, are the roots of these four directions. Furthermore, each of these four directions would be corresponding later as an element. We see that here in our reality. For example, we know that the sun rises from the east, and so the east is associated with the air. We know that the south is where the sun peaks, and so that's associated with the heat of the day, the fire. And we know that the sun sets in the west, and so that's associated with the earth. And we know that no light comes from the north. The sun does not come into the north, and so it's associated with the water. An example, a cold environment. And so we see that these four directions manifest here physically later in the world after these refinements of potential as the four directions. And so these four directions were rooted in the limits of the endless, meaning that the moment of its restriction created four limits. That means that which would come from its width, that which would come from its length, that which would come from its height, and that which would come from its depth. And these limits created the first circle, the first restriction, the first rung, which is called Keter. We call it Keter because this first ring would form a crown to all the other lights, meaning all the other lights in the restriction would be crowned by this first light. And in this first light, it was called Ani, that is to say, I. Because the term I, which is a saruf of the word Ain, Aleph Yod Nun, Aleph Nun Yod, which is to say I. Because the second you say I, you notice there's a differentiation. I, therefore, comes to include you, meaning another. For at first, this was impossible. When the endless is a unified singularity, there is no I, there is no you. There's only being. But this first rung of Keter, which is the first restriction, is called pure thought. Makshava Peshato. A pure thought, like Peshat, a simple thought. The simple thought was Ani, I. And because there was no division between this first rung of Keter and the limit in which it was birthed from, there was no separation between it and the endless. And therefore, this first rung of Keter, this first ring of Keter, personified its own being as the endless itself. Therefore, it was called I, Ani. Furthermore, something miraculous happened. The opposite was brought forth at the moment of the limit. For I explained to you that the limit came from width, length, height, and depth. The light contracted within on itself from all directions. Because that which was in the right moved to the left, and that which was in the left moved to the right. Because it was explained in Likute that the endless expounded to the boundary of the endless, and there was no end to its boundary, which means it's growing exponentially in a certain direction. The opposite of this is restriction, which is moving the opposite direction. So the Simsum brought forth the opposite of all of these things, that the right would place its limit and then move immediately to the left to gather in the center. The left would immediately set its limit and then move to the right. gathering to its center. The height would set its limit at the height, and then immediately move towards the depth to be gathered in its center. And the depth would immediately set its limit and move towards the height to be gathered to its limit. This is alluded to in wisdom and understanding. This is alluded to in the right and the left. Because at this exact moment of withdrawal, the roots of all the limits were brought into existence, and then they moved in the opposite direction. Now, the opposite directions are the roots of Yod, He, Vav, and He. So to expound, it was explained that the restriction was the secret of the mind, and the hard spark was the secret of thought. Now, it was also explained that the 231 gates are hinted to by thought, and that Aleph Yod Nun is the secret of 231. Now, another level to this is that this vacancy that would be brought into existence, our sages, we call it the Tehiru. And the Zohar is called the Tehiru, which comes from the word Tahor. Well, the word Tehiru has a numerical value of 231. And furthermore, 72, 63, 45, and 52 also has a numerical value of Tehiru. They all have the numerical value of 231, which means the expansions of the 72. So 72 plus 63 plus 45 plus 52 equals 231 mklo. And the general idea behind this is that the vacancy brought forth the roots of the potential of all things. For the root of the potential of Yod would be found in Shin, the root of the potential of He would be found in Aleph, the root of the potential of the Vav would be found in Mem, and the root of the final He would be found in the potential of the Mem Sophit. Because, as I explained, Shin, Aleph, Mem, Mem were the root of the limits. And immediately when the limits withdrew and contracted from itself, it produced the opposite, which means the right went to the left, and the left went to the right. This was alluded to when Sefer Yetzirah tells us that 3 mothers produced 3 father letters, because the opposite of mother is father, the opposite of the female is the male. There's a secret behind this, because the opposite of receiving is creating. And so the first thing that gathered into the mind, that is to say, that gathered into the restriction, was the potential. And this potential was manifested in the secret of Yod, He, Vav, He. And so it was shown on the Ilanot that the Simsum, or the restriction, has inside of it Yod, He, Vav, He. Now, I explained in brief detail the secret of the first ring, which is called the first limit, and how this first limit was called Ein and Ani. For the Ein had become Ani at the limits of the first restriction. That is to say, the first ring. That is to say that it would become the Keter. And it was aroused by a simple thought. And the simple thought was I. And it identified itself as the endless, being rooted in the limit of the endless itself, being the first definition of the endless itself. And because of this, there was no need for it to move, and there was no need for it to act, but it simply remained. And so it was called Keter. And it illuminated like a crown, which was what Keter means, like a crown to all the lower lights. Thus, the second restriction is called substantial thought. The second restriction is the second ring inside of that restriction, because we're still within the first restriction. We're still within the mind. We're still within the mind. The first level of the mind, the first level of the restriction, is called simple thought. The second level within the restriction is called substantial thought. Why was it called substantial thought? It was called substantial thought because the second ring conceived a separation from the limit of the endless by what we call Keter, the root of Keter. Not that we should think that Keter is in this place, because there's no manifestation of spheros yet. There's no manifestation of any of these things. But rather, the substantial thought saw that it was separated. It was separated from the limit of the endless by the first limit, which is the simple thought. And these two things were differentiated as different kinds of light. And this was hinted and alluded to, where I was explaining the Torah of Mashiach, that as the light entered into the restriction, it differentiated itself. This differentiation of light also represents a differentiation in states of consciousness, different types of consciousness. So, to understand about the secrets of the mind, we'll examine how this relates specifically to this matter. So it was explained that the restriction is the secret of the mind. This is a passive space. The restriction is an environment where all of the other existences would come into being. It was a vacancy where there was no vacancy. And so the mind is very similar like this. The mind becomes an environment in which potential may come into being. And everything that is inside of the mind exists only as potentials. Because the very first stage, what is the opposite of being, as I stated, is potential. And therefore, the very first purpose, the very first act in bringing forth opposites of itself was to bring forth potential. Because at the highest level, in the illimitable light, it existed as being, unified in one existence. The illimitable was being and is being. But the opposite of this, again, is potential. So all that was within the mind was being brought forth through potential. Another secret to this is that the opposite of being in an unchanging and absolute state is being in a limited and changing state. Again, the opposite of the illimitable. For this exact reason, there are orders and processes by which potentiality becomes actuality. For the supernal Chokmah is called potential. And that is to say, this restriction, everything that's happening in here is existing within realms of potential. Just like the mind conceives a potential. So the mind, which is the restriction, came by varying degrees of light and varying degrees of thought process. This entire secret is alluded to in great detail inside of this SEFER. Just the first two were briefly expounded to you. That is to say, the simple and the substantial. The simple and every single one of these grades would create a division. Because what is the opposite of a unified singularity? A limited multiplicity. And so that the limits would each bring forth a different quality, a different attribute, a different diversification of the one being in different modes. So the mind, which brought forth this first level, gathered into that heart spark. That is to say, the light of the restriction gathered into thought. Because it's written, in the beginning when Israel arose in thought. This idea of the 231 gates being thought creates two things. First, we know that the 231 gates is called Elohim. Because it's the secret of Bina. And we know that Keter Hokmah Bina is Ein Sof Or. Bina is the secret of the craftsman. Elohim is the secret of the craftsman. So this teaches us that the craftsman, or thought, right, is a craftsman to the mind. So the mind receives a potential, and thought begins to form the potential through creation, formation, and ultimately brings it into action. When the mind receives something, it exists as a potential, an idea. And then thought, through contemplation, moves upon that potential, refining the potential, creating the potential, bringing it from the level of potential into creation through defining it, into the formation for the potential of execution and action, finally. And so we find that within the mind were gathered a few things. One, the entire potential of thought. Because the thought is the 231 gates, which was Aleph with every letter and every letter with Aleph, etc. So that all that could be potential first gathered, and this is what produced thought. Thought could not exist before this. And so the heart spark is the secret of that thought. But what was the first potential? Well, the first potential that came about in the thought was Shin, Aleph, Mem, Mem. For Aleph separates Mem from Shin is the root of even the Spheros. And the reason why this is the first potential is because the first limits of the simple was the limit of the height, the limit of the depth, the limit of the length, the limit of the width, which was the root of Shin, Aleph, Mem, Mem. And it produced, from its potential of the Atzilus, it produced a male. That is to say, it produced Yod-He, Vav-He, the potential of what would be Atzilus, the potential of what would be Beriah, the potential of what would be Yetzirah, and the potential of what would be Asiya. And this is hinted at by the expansion of the 72, 63, 45, 52, because the value of these names is the value of Tehiru. It is also the same as the value of 231. This idea tells us that they gather particularly to the heart spark, because the light of the height, the depth, the length, and the width gathered from all directions precisely in the center, meaning in the heart spark. And so just as I said that the root of Shin, Aleph, Mem, Mem in its first manifestation from potential into actualization occurred when Shin, Aleph, Mem, and Mem set the roots of the limit of the withdrawal, it moved in the opposite direction, bringing forth the potential of what would be Yod-He, Vav-He. And so the secret of Yod-He, Vav-He gathered into the heart spark. That is to say, it gathered in to thought. So the first thought that aroused in God's mind, alongside that first level, which is what I said was simple thought, Ani, would be Yod-He, Vav-He. The reason why it would be Yud-Ke, Vav-Ke is because Yud-Ke, Vav-Ke, the roots of it, emerged from the roots of the four limits. These four limits were grounded in Shin, Aleph, and Mem. And this is why it says in the Torah, Ani, Yod-He, Vav-He. I am Hashem. For Ani, which is the first ring of Keter, which was called the simple thought, in which Ain said I, and both the Milui of Ani and Ain are both 231, conceived Yud-Ke, Vav-Ke. And the potential of Yud-Ke, Vav-Ke, which is the roots of the Spheros, which is the secret of all of the worlds and the partsuits and everything else, gathered into the heart spark. The heart spark is the secret of thought. In the beginning, when Israel arose in thought. Because the 22 letters, as we say that they are gathered into the thought, represents the entirety of its potential.
Okay.
But Yod-He, Vav-He that gathers inside of the potential produces the first thought of that potential. So what was the first manifestation of thought within inside of the potential?
You have to write down. Yeah.
That is the level called I. And so it says again, Ani Hashem. So there's another level to this. The other level of Ani Hashem is this tells us what would cause the mind, which produced an image, as it's mentioned in the order of emanation, for with inside of it, the pattern of the divine entered into the restriction, which is, of course, tree on top of tree, the backs and fronts, the spheros, and everything else. We learn thus that the mind produces image and thought produces words, because the thought is rooted in the 22 letters, which are the 231 combinations. But that Yud-Ke, Vav-Ke gathered inside of this thought. That is to say, the light of Yud-He, Vav-He, the light of the four directions gathered into the heart spark. And thus the heart spark conceived I, and then Hashem. Ani, which was the simple thought. And then it conceived Yud-Ke, Vav-Ke. That is to say, the root of this. And this is hinted at in all the various places where it says, I am Yud-Ke, Vav-Ke. And beside me is Ain, which the simple ones read as nothing. Beside me is none. But in reality, the wise ones know that Yud-Ke, Vav-Ke is talking about Ain, which is beside it. Because what's the opposite of an uncreated, unformed God? An unmanifested God? And the answer is a created one. One that was brought forth. One that had a beginning and an end. A height, a depth, a width, a length, a limit. One that could be defined. And so the entire causation of thought of God was to bring forth these worlds. So the word tehiru, which is what we call the vacancy, again, has a value of 72, 63, 45, 52. For the limit of the withdrawal were the roots of the backs and fronts of the spheros. And thus there are 10 letters to the 72, 10 to the 63, 10 to the 45, etc. And these letters of its expansion hint to the roots of the spheros of Atzilus, the roots of the spheros of Berea, the roots of the spheros of Yetzirah, the roots of the spheros of Asiya. And their roots are to be found in one unity that were divided between width, length, height, and depth when they gathered first into thought. Only when they emerge outside of thought, that is to say, manifestation through action, is there any type of differentiation in terms of construct of worlds and pursuits, etc., etc., etc. The reason why this occurred is because thought first conceived the potential, and then from the potential sought to create, and from the creation sought to form, and from the formation sought to place it into action. And so we find that thought acts as a craftsman to the mind, for the mind receives a potential, and thought, being craftsman, refines potential to ultimately bring it forth into actualization. And so we see that in Likute and inside of the Ilans, the Simsum, the restriction, has Yod, He, Vav, He. The purpose is that the root of Atzilus, Berea, Yetzirah, Asiya, within inside of the restriction itself, for all the worlds have all of the worlds, and inside of the restriction, these worlds represent the following: the potential, the process in which the potential is moved to creation, which is to say it's defined, and then from definition to be formed, that is to say the process in which creation is then brought into how is this to be brought forth, and then finally it's moved into action. And our sages hinted and alluded to this, where they said that he looked into the Torah, and also in the Midrash it tells us before creation, and also in the Midrash it tells us that it's like a craftsman who had a blueprint, because before anything is brought forth, a blueprint first exists. That means something written on paper first exists. The idea of this paper is the supernal whiteness. That is to say, within inside of the endless itself was engraved a beautiful structure, a beautiful image, which was the restriction. And within inside of the restriction was brought forth the potential and an image. The image was like the blueprint. And I've explained the roots of where that image and blueprint came from, which was Shin, Aleph, Mem, Mem. So that everything would be divided in thought by Aleph separates Mem from Shin. That the great emanator in his great wisdom and in the supernal mind would conceive to bring forth everything Aleph separates Mem from Shin, including the tree. And when he sought to conceive himself through the mind and understand himself, he divided even Yud-Ke Vav-Ke by the principles of Aleph separates Mem from Shin, which was hinted at in Sefer Yetzirah, where it says 3 mothers produce 3 fathers. And within that, the great structure began its process of creation, Shin, Aleph, Mem, Mem. And from the creation of the limit was brought forth formation. Formation is the secret of Yud-Ke Vav-Ke, restricting itself into the thought. And once it gathered into the thought, thought moved into action. So these are the first levels of what happened in the beginning. And it's all alluded to in the order of emanation. It's all alluded to in Likute. And again, I thought to place some of these secrets in plain writing, but it's not quite the time, although it does exist in plain writing privately, but this matter is not time for it to be spoken too plainly and too clearly available to this world yet. It's not quite ready. The world is not quite ready. There's a lot more prerequisites to understand things, because these levels are very, very holy, very, very lofty, very, very sacred, and it cannot be reduced to wheat. Although you will find hints of what I've said in various different places. The first hint is to be found in the word bait, which is to say house, for wisdom built her house. Her, because the restriction is likened to a contraction. A contraction is likened to a pregnancy. A pregnancy is likened to giving birth, because the opposite of an unbegotten creation is a begotten creation. Obviously, the illimitable is unbegotten, and so it's the opposite, being begotten. And so the simsum, or restriction, is called contractions, because it begets. Similarly, the word bait in Atbash is Shin Mem Aleph, because Aleph, Mem, and Shin is the secret of wisdom built a house. For the restriction, which is Chokmah, brought forth the first principle, which is Shin, Mem, and Aleph, Aleph, Mem, Shin, from the four directions as it was explained. Similarly, this is hinted in the word Bereshis, because Bereshis is base Rosh. We translate as first house, but Beit is Shin, Mem, Aleph. And so base Rosh can be read as Shin, Mem, Aleph, Rosh. Shin, Mem, Aleph was first. Our sage says it's based on Mikdash because it existed before creation existed. But now it can be an even deeper level. Base Rosh means Shin, Mem, Aleph were in the Rosh. That is to say the head. Because within the head lies the mind. And within the mind lies thought. And so base Rosh indeed. Because in the head was conceived Shin, Mem, Aleph. That is to say, from the four directions, which were the root of the mother letters. Because the mother letters are rooted in the being of the illimitable. For within the being of the illimitable, the Lashon HaKodesh, which is diversified and limited multiplicity here as a division of his attributes, exists in pure oneness in his own being, because it is his own being. And therefore, the first divisions of that which is one into that which is a limited multiplicity is according to his own substance, his own existence. And his own substance and his own existence is in Et, Aleph to Tav. And these, of course, are divided between mothers, doubles, and elementals, as we know them. This is the secret of he wraps himself in light, because light is Ein Sof, value Ein Sof. That is to say, the restriction, which was called Ein Sof. And similarly, it was also stated that he wraps himself in light as Et, that is to say, he wraps himself in the 22 letters. So all of these things are brought into existence in generalities in what I've just said. But contemplate very carefully. So I'm not going to go too deep into this. We can get into the Zohar, but contemplate very carefully what I said about the roots of the limits, the root of the height, the root of the depth, the root of the width, the root of the length, and consider how they were divided by necessity from the bringing out of the existence of his unity. That is to say, the letters exist as being, not that the letters themselves have any differentiation or that they're even in that place, but rather that the substance of his own essence, which is personified in those letters, which are nothing but kalim or vessels, were brought forth, because the opposite of being is potential. And the first potential to be brought forth was the mother letters. And they were rooted in the limits of the withdrawal, and how the restriction gathered in the opposite directions. And that opposite directions produced another opposite, for the opposite of female is the male. And the roots of Yod, He, Vav, and He, which are the roots of Atzilus, Bria, Tzirsia, which is the roots of south, north, east, and west, came into being and gathered into the light from all directions, gathered into the heart spark. The heart spark, we know, is the 231 gates, which was thought, the letters, which is how thought operates. For thought is conceived by combinations of letters, which produce words and sound. And without this, there is no thought. Then consider how the very first thing in thought, the very first thing in the heart spark was Yod-He Vav-He and Shin Aleph Mem Mem. Aleph separates Mem from Shin. That everything in all of the creation that would be conceived by the supernal emanator would be brought forth according to Aleph separates Mem from Shin, because its root from the pure thought gathered, the pure thought which said Ani, I, and gathered from all directions, so that the thought would conceive Aleph separates Mem from Shin, and the thought would conceive Yod-He Vav-He. And then, having conceived the idea of I, brought forth to know I. So Yod-He Vav-He would later emerge from thought, because the purpose of the supernal emanator was to bring forth from potential into existence. And at the point that I'm talking to you now, everything described is only at the level of potentials. But the entire purpose of potential is to bring forth into actualization. And I have not explained a single detail outside of the realm of potential. But nonetheless, also consider how the four worlds were personified here. And understand how thought is a craftsman to the mind. For the mind receives potential from the illimitable, and thought seeks as a craftsman to refine potential. First creating, that means the limit of the restriction. and then drawing in the secret of formation, formalizing it into itself to actualize it, to bring it into action. And so these first steps are very critical as to the process of the Atik and its emanation. And there are many exhaustive details that I can't quite get into in this particular class, but I wanted to share with you all just a small fragment of what's inside of the secret Sefer and what's going on at these levels, and how all of these things can be seen should you probe Likute, and should you probe the Elon and take it to its highest conclusions, because the highest purpose that we can do as human beings is obtain Da'as of Hashem. And the roadmap for understanding the Da'as of Hashem is the Elon, which means there is no greater thing that one could do than to contemplate to the highest degree all aspects of the Elon. Because the Elon is the system by which Hashem emanates and reveals himself. It's the order of creation. It's the very Das of Hashem. And therefore, every single secret is a supernal key. You know, we see things like the Simsum, it's circular. Okay, the light pours in, then it pours in circular. Well, we find out that light actually is circular. We find that light is divided by degrees of vibration because the light differentiated itself with inside of the restriction. It's the same thing with sound. We find that sound is both circular and conal. Every single key in the Torah of Mashiach, which reveals all the secrets of reality, is derived specifically from the Elon. So all of these other keys about what I'm revealing to you now is also rooted inside of this. So, okay, that'll bring us to the conclusion of this lesson, and then we'll enter into the Zohar in a few minutes. But as David HaMelech said, open my eyes and I behold the wonder of your Torah. Contemplate very carefully the depth of what was being said. Without the imagery, it's a little difficult, but that'll conclude this. Okay, Shalom and Salah, everybody.